For as long as humans have been writing stories, the balance between light and darkness has been a recurring theme in fiction. They are two polar opposite forces, one representing hope, purity, and lawfulness, and the other representing death, destruction, and emptiness, but neither can exist without the other. This is a classic dichotomy that has inspired writers throughout history and continues to be popular in works of art today, including in video games. Not only have video game writers continued the traditions of storytelling using these themes, but developers have also incorporated the qualities of both the light and the dark as gameplay elements. One such game is Alan Wake, a psychological thriller created by Remedy Entertainment and initially released as an Xbox 360 exclusive in 2010. The game took inspiration from famous horror and thriller storytellers like David Lynch, Rod Serling, and especially Stephen King, with the studio crafting a less action-heavy and more cinematic adventure. Since its launch, Alan Wake has gained a moderate but incredibly devoted fan base that has given the game a cult status, and to this day, many who played it refer to the game as a masterpiece. I've always enjoyed the game myself, but I did find the label of masterpiece to be a little confusing. There's no doubt that the game is good, and I do count it as one of my favorite horror games, but a masterpiece it is not. That's what I've always believed, but I wanted to re-examine this game and find out whether it really is a hidden gem that more people need to play, or just a really solid horror game, and that's what we're gonna do today. This is Alan Wake. Remedy Entertainment was formed in 1995 in Finland, becoming one of the first Finnish commercial game developers. The studio began its career with Death Rally, a vehicular combat game published by Apogee Software in 1996, and would later follow it up with the critically acclaimed third-person shooter Max Payne in 2001, and its sequel, Max Payne 2: The Fall of Max Payne, in 2003. The last two in particular cemented Remedy as a company that took a cinematic approach to developing games, designing adventures that didn't ignore the story and instead built it as a core part of the experience. After Max Payne 2, Remedy wanted to go in a new direction, and the team conceptualized an open-world game set in a small American town that took inspiration from TV shows in regards to the format of the narrative. One of the early concepts of the game revolved around survival, as the player would have to gather resources during the day and then use them to survive during the night with a real-time day-to-night cycle in place. To do this, as well as render the complex environments and get the gameplay looking and feeling the way they wanted, Remedy had to build their own engine and tools for handling physics and effects. Some of the team even took an extensive tour of the Pacific Northwest as research for the setting, taking over 40,000 photos and even consulting NASA star maps to ensure the constellations in the skybox were correct. Remedy showed off early demos of the game to the public as early as 2005, as they were looking for a publisher, eventually partnering with Microsoft Game Studios to bring the game to PC and Xbox 360. However, the studio was struggling to unify all their ideas together and solidify a game that successfully combined working gameplay elements. Microsoft wasn't helping, as while the publisher was making an effort to help Remedy solve their problems, it ended up being what Remedy creative director and writer Sam Lake described as a too-many-cooks situation. Eventually, Remedy pulled the team leaders from core areas of the project and formed what became known as the Sauna Group, who were forced into a room to finally figure out and lock down everything that worked. Their goal was to keep as many of the ideas the team had come up with as possible while giving the game solid direction, and they deliberately put themselves under intense pressure to get the game back on track. It took about 2 months for the Sauna Group to accomplish their task, but the end result was a switch from the open world style to a more linear setting, a finalized design for the enemies, and a revamped gameplay loop. This was the shot in the arm Remedy needed, as with a better focus on what the game should be, the team was able to create elements that synergized with the visions and goals for the project. It had taken Remedy 5 years to develop the game since its initial prototypes, but finally Alan Wake was finished in early 2010. By this point, however, the PC release was scrapped in favor of making it an Xbox 360 exclusive, and while Remedy and Microsoft toyed with the idea of an episodic release over Xbox Live Arcade, the final game was a physical printing with all 6 of the game's episodes in one package. Alan Wake was released on May 18, 2010, coincidentally the same day that Rockstar Games released Red Dead Redemption, and also coincidentally, though it isn't really relevant, my 14th birthday. Competing against Red Dead meant that the game ultimately didn't sell very well at launch, though over time, word of mouth and a growing cult status helped make the game at least modestly successful. Today, Alan Wake continues to be a beloved Remedy property, with constant demand for a sequel and even a television series supposedly in the works, though not a lot of info has come out about this series since 2018. But why do so many love Alan Wake, and how well does the game hold up? Well, let's dive in and find out. Alan Wake begins with its titular protagonist, the writer Alan Wake, having a dream where he runs over a hitchhiker in the middle of the night as he's trying to reach a lighthouse for an unknown reason. When he leaves the car to investigate, the hitchhiker disappears, and Alan suddenly comes face to face with shadowy humanoid figures as well as a swirling tornado of darkness. The creatures nearly overrun Alan, but a mysterious light sends them away and instructs Alan on defeating them. This segment acts as a tutorial to the gameplay, teaching the player how to dodge enemy attacks and use their flashlight to stun enemies. But it also lets you know immediately that the darkness is dangerous and that light is the most powerful weapon you have. When Alan finally makes it to the lighthouse, his relief is cut short when the lights go out and something unseen attacks him, causing Alan to wake up. Alan and his wife Alice are traveling to Bright Falls, Washington, a quiet lakeside mountain town where the couple is taking a vacation to help Alan get over his writer's block. Here we have a calmer experience than the dream, as it takes place during the day and Alan meets the residents of Bright Falls, who, while a little quirky, are much more grounded than what Alan saw in his nightmare. What's intriguing though is how Alan reacts to all of this. In the first 20 minutes of the game, we see Alan's perspective on both his dark, brooding dreams and secluded small-town life, and neither brings him any joy or comfort. His nightmare and Bright Falls represent foreign ideas to Alan, with the dream being a hostile force against him and Bright Falls being a kind and gentle force, and both make Alan feel apprehensive, setting up Alan's personality and eventual character arc. After receiving the keys and directions from a mysterious old woman in a black mourning dress, Alan and Alice arrive at their cabin on Cauldron Lake and begin settling in. However, when Alice presents Alan with a typewriter hoping that he can continue his writing, Alan gets frustrated and storms out, even as Alice, who has a fear of the dark, panics when the lights suddenly turn off. Not soon after, Alan hears Alice screaming and immediately heads back, where it appears that Alice fell into the lake, and Alan dives in to rescue her. Suddenly, Alan wakes up inside a crashed car with a head injury and no memory of how he got there, how long he was out, or where Alice is. Without any leads, Alan decides to walk to a nearby gas station to call for help, but his journey takes him through a dark forest at night where the same creatures from his dream, called Taken, show up and want Alan dead. Alan Wake takes elements from the psychological thriller and survival horror genres and plants them into a third-person action-adventure game. Your only real controls outside of combat are moving and jumping, with every other action tied to a context-sensitive button input. Alan can also sprint for a limited time, and the sprint button also makes Alan dodge if it's pressed in combination with a direction. Jumping feels very stiff, as Alan's jump is delayed in a realistic but not very fluid manner, and not helping is Alan's airborne maneuverability, which is heavy and unwieldy. In fairness, Alan Wake rarely asks you to do any serious platforming, but when it does, I always tense up, and not in a "this is a terrifying situation" way, but a "will the game let me do this without killing me" way. The camera is positioned behind Alan's shoulders, though you can switch which shoulder the camera is centered behind with the push of a button, letting you better see where enemies are coming from. Alan's health is represented not only by the bar in the top left, but also by the screen getting fuzzier and losing color as you take more damage. I find this a really good visual indicator that you're low on health, especially since the actual health bar is tucked away in the corner, not to mention it makes the combat feel more cinematic. Alan will regain some of his health back eventually, but to fully heal yourself after taking injuries, you need to stand underneath a light source known as a safe haven, which heals Alan completely. Entering a safe haven also creates a checkpoint, and since the light is so visually distinct from the darkness that surrounds it, it's also a good indicator of where you need to go next. But at some point you will need to fight the Taken, and while fighting enemies in Alan Wake is simple, and some might say rudimentary, the game does push the mechanics it has to the limit. Alan has two methods of attacking, his flashlight and an assortment of firearms and throwable weapons. Alan will point his flashlight wherever you aim, and the light not only illuminates objects, but it also stuns enemies and slows them down. Bursting your flashlight allows you to take down a Taken's shields, which makes them vulnerable to your weapons. Your flashlight can also destroy objects that are corrupted by the darkness and act possessed, flinging themselves at Alan and causing obstructions. The combat isn't exactly groundbreaking at its foundation, but the smaller details in how the game works make the combat more enthralling. The game doesn't have an aiming reticule, so you have to use the flashlight instead, which is a brilliant organic method of aim assistance. Also, ammo is reloaded individually rather than with full clips, so if you only need one bullet, you can put it in quickly and take your enemy down. Conversely, a complete reload takes more time and leaves you open, though mashing the reload button does let you load up faster. Alan Wake's gameplay isn't super complex, but it does enough to highlight the tension and suspense without making you feel completely helpless. After stumbling through the woods and crossing through a logging site, Alan makes it to the gas station where he calls the police, with Bright Falls Sheriff Sarah Breaker answering his call. Alan says his wife has disappeared, but when he mentions the cabin on Cauldron Lake, the sheriff tells Wake that there is no cabin there and that there hasn't been for decades, not since the previous cabin on Diver's Isle, where Alan and Alice's cabin was, collapsed after a volcanic eruption. Sure enough, Sheriff Breaker drives Alan out to Diver's Isle and nothing is standing there, leaving Alan confused and faced with even more questions. When episode 2 begins, we get a brief flashback to Alan's life in New York with Alice before his writer's block set in. During a blizzard, the power goes out in their apartment and Alice begins having a panic attack, but Alan calms her down by talking about his childhood fear of the dark and how he believed in a magical light switch called the Clicker which would vanquish the darkness. In the present, Alan is being held at the Bright Falls Sheriff Station where he's about to relate his story to Sheriff Breaker, but before he can, he receives a phone call and hears Alice's voice. Then, another voice claims that he's kidnapped Alice and demands to meet with Alan that night at Lover's Peak in Elderwood National Park. Alan heads back inside and meets Dr. Emil Hartman, a psychiatrist specializing in treating artists who reveals that he persuaded Alice to bring Alan up to Bright Springs so that the doctor could help him. Enraged, Alan punches Hartman in the face, but before any more damage can be done, his agent, Barry Wheeler, steps in and escorts him away. Alan confides in Barry about everything that's happened, and Barry, understandably, is skeptical of his claims of sentient darkness, though he does believe that Alice has been kidnapped. Renting a cabin at Elderwood, the two wait until nightfall before Alan leaves to confront the kidnapper alone. You'll face more Taken on your way to Lover's Peak, and it's around this point where proper weapon management becomes critical. The game gives you 5 weapon slots total, one for your pistol, which deals medium damage and fires reasonably quickly, one for heavier weapons like the shotgun and hunting rifle, one for your flare gun, which both breaks shields and damages Taken but has extremely limited ammo and can only fire one flare at a time, one for flares, which deal shield damage over a period of time and drive Taken away from Alan, and one for flashbangs, which act similarly to the flare gun but bounce around and instantly explode if they touch a Taken. Alan can only carry so much ammo for each weapon, and learning how and when to use each one is the key to coming out of battles unscathed. Some Taken can absorb a lot of bullets before going down, and while you can knock back weaker ones with gunshots if their shields aren't broken, your best bet is to save your firepower for when the Taken is vulnerable. That goes double for the flashlight, which becomes your best friend in fighting off the dark abyss of Bright Falls. The flashlight is powered by batteries, but the meter doesn't drain unless you burst the flashlight, which recharges slowly unless you put a battery in. There's never a point where your flashlight turns off, but running out of juice means you need to wait for it to recharge or place in a new battery before bursting, which leaves you with little chance to drain enemy shields. Thankfully, ammo and battery refills are fairly plentiful, with loose ammo and emergency restock boxes placed in numerous locations in each level, and while they aren't so frequent as to make ammo counting a non-issue, you should rarely be completely unprepared. The only times you'll really feel the stress is when the game strips items away from you, which happens during cutscenes and between episodes. Learning how to dodge and staying within the light whenever possible is essential to surviving without a means to fight back. Once Alan reaches Lover's Peak, he meets with the kidnapper who has pages of a manuscript written by Alan for a story called Departure, which details events happening in the real world, though Alan has no memory of writing this story. The kidnapper demands that Alan bring him the rest of the pages of the manuscript in return for Alice, but Alan isn't in the mood to haggle and retaliates by punching the kidnapper, sending the two of them off the cliff. Alan can find pages of the manuscript across every level, indicated by a bright piece of paper, though some parts of the manuscript can only be found on the hardest difficulty, Nightmare mode. Despite the pages being a plot element, in-game it's not required to find them, though it is recommended that you pick them up. Pages either describe events that happen in the future, giving the players a heads up on what they can expect, or flesh out the world by providing details on characters or events that happen outside Alan's perspective. In addition to the pages, Alan can pick up hidden coffee thermoses that serve no purpose other than to fulfill an arbitrary counter, and the same goes for the alarm clocks, cardboard cutouts, and Night Spring video games in the special episodes. Some of these force you to go out of your way to explore every nook and cranny or go down hidden pathways to find them, which is also useful for finding the ammo caches, stockpiles of batteries, ammo, and weapons whose locations are revealed by shining a light on glow-in-the-dark paint. Alan's scuffle with the kidnapper leaves him stranded in the forest again, but he finds his way back to the cabin where he sees it and Barry under attack by birds made out of darkness. After dispatching them, Barry realizes that Alan wasn't lying about the Taken, and the next day, he searches for information about the kidnapper and the history of the town while Alan tries to write a fake manuscript to present to the kidnapper, but his writer's block prevents him from doing so. Barry catches a break when he receives a call from the diner waitress Rose, who says she has the manuscript, but it's immediately clear to the player that something isn't right, and the final shot confirms those suspicions.
Good girl.
Alan and Barry head over to Rose's home in a trailer park to pick up the pages of the manuscript, but after entering her house, Rose drugs the two of them as she has been taken over by the woman in the morning dress. When Alan wakes up, it's already nightfall and an FBI agent named Nightingale shows up to take Alan in, demonstrating how unpredictable and unhinged he is by firing at Alan when he tries to run away. Alan once again escapes to a forest in the mountains where he needs to avoid the police and meet with the kidnapper, whom Alan plans to get aggressive with in order to get his wife back. This part of the game sticks out to me because it's one of the only sections where you truly have no means of defending yourself from the enemies. You're not fighting any Taken here, but instead you need to avoid the police searchlights or else you'll be shot at. Gameplay-wise, it isn't hard to do this, since all it requires is that you learn how and when flashlights will move and only move forward when it's safe. But I find it an interesting inversion of the light and dark motif that this game highlights during each chapter. Normally the light indicates safety and the dark indicates danger, but here it's the exact opposite, since entering the light, unless you know it's a safe haven, means you're opening yourself up to police fire. That's a brilliant way to toy with the theme of light versus dark and play off your expectations regarding which is the desired state. Despite its darker themes and occasionally scary moments, it'd be a stretch to call Alan Wake a horror game. Instead, it's more of a psychological thriller where the horror influences the story thematically instead of setting the tone of the adventure. Scares are relegated mostly to jump scares, which honestly I'm not a fan of. Alan Wake does get them right sometimes, such as when objects suddenly fly toward you and when the music swells up as the Taken get close. But I'm talking about the instances where Alan stumbles and the screen flashes with images of Alice screaming accompanied by a loud shriek, the type of jump scare that makes people dislike jump scares. They don't add to the tension of the moment, they're just a cheap way for the game to shock the player with deafening noise rather than subtle disturbing horror, though thankfully these scares aren't very frequent. After some time, Alan winds up at a radio station where Nightingale and Sheriff Breaker catch up with him. Nightingale once again fires at Alan, who escapes and finds a car that he drives to his designated meeting spot with the kidnapper, an abandoned coal mine converted into a museum. Alan waits until nightfall for the kidnapper, who never shows up, calling to tell Alan that there's been a change in plans and to meet him at the lookout on Mirror Peak. In order to reach this lookout, Alan travels through the abandoned mining town and through the mines themselves, leading to some of the darkest settings so far in the game. Alan Wake is drenched in a dark, shadowy atmosphere that isn't just used as a gameplay feature as the darkness represents hazardous space, but also informs the mood of each location. Alan travels through a number of locations, typically surrounded by forests or mountain cliffsides, emphasizing a claustrophobic setting that's only enhanced by a beautiful use of darkness and fog. The game purposefully obscures parts of each level to make it seem that the darkness stretches on forever, which is only mitigated by the flashlight. It's an absolutely stunning visual look, but even just talking about the graphical fidelity, the game has held up pretty decently. Character models have plenty of detail, and environments differentiate themselves in terms of texture and color choice, which is especially impressive since everything is baked in darkness most of the time. Unfortunately, the facial animations are sometimes distractingly awkward, and can sometimes take a big dip into Uncanny Valley. This was a time where motion capture technology was evolving into what we know it as today, so I can't blame the game too much for this, but some faces just look unsettling or downright goofy. Sound design is a whole other beast though, as many sounds tend to blend into each other with softer timbres as opposed to sharper sounds which would stick out against everything else. It helps add to the suspenseful atmosphere by muddying some sound effects and making it harder to hear exactly where things are, especially since the dark wind that constantly plays during the game helps drown everything out, putting you on edge throughout the journey. Alan Wake features both a diegetic and non-diegetic soundtrack, with licensed music, mostly rock and alternative songs, playing on radios in between episodes, helping to ground the game in our reality. The song selection is enjoyable, with a nice range of styles and eras represented, and I will always be happy at the inclusion of the Black Angels. I can't say much for the score by Petri Alanko, as it's mostly in the background accentuating other elements rather than being at the center. That's definitely appropriate though, as keeping the music quiet during gameplay keeps the player invested in the other sounds that make them uneasy, and bringing the volume up during battles or cutscenes helps set the tone of these sequences. While I do like some of these songs and the arrangements, it isn't what I'd call a sticks-in-your-head soundtrack, and it fittingly takes a back seat to the excellent sound design. When Alan makes it to Mirror Peak, he finds the kidnapper, a local man named Ben Mott, apparently being tortured by the darkness and tearfully claiming that he doesn't have Alice. All he wants is the manuscript. We're not sure why yet, but when Alan enters the scene, the dark presence, the manifestation of darkness, transforms into a tornado, kills Mott, and goes after Alan, who lights a flare and is thrown into the lake below. Alan begins drowning, but a mysterious hand reaches out from the surface and begins to pull him back to what he believes is safety. When Alan regains consciousness, he discovers that the man who rescued him from the lake was Dr. Hartman, who says that Alan is currently a patient of his at his mental clinic. Hartman claims that Alice drowned in Cauldron Lake the night she and Alan arrived, and that Alan has been imagining events to cope with his loss, and that in order to cure himself, he must continue his writing. Alan doesn't believe him, but he plays along while he tries to find a means of escape, which comes to him in the form of Odin and Tor Anderson, two aging rock stars who used to play in a band called the Old Gods of Asgard. They tell Alan that Hartman is lying to him and clue him into a way to defeat the darkness at their old farm. Later, while Alan is attempting to write, the Andersons start a fight that allows Alan to slip away unnoticed, coming across a captured Barry, whom Hartman locked up near his office in the process. The two confront Hartman, and the doctor admits that he's been lying about Alice and that he's just keeping Alan at his lodge because he wants to use Alan's ability to create something wonderful, and that Mott was under his employ trying to get the manuscript. However, before he can go into more detail, the Dark Presence enters the lodge with Alan and Barry sealing it and Hartman inside the room, with the doctor's ultimate fate unknown. Alan and Barry leave the lodge and drive towards the Anderson farm in order to find the clue that the brothers left behind. The beginning of this chapter plays up the mystery surrounding the game's story, specifically whether or not what we see is happening in Alan's head. It's difficult to determine this since we experience the game entirely from Alan's perspective, so distinguishing between reality and his mind filling in the gaps with his own creativity requires a lot of examination. It's possible that he's suffering from some form of mental illness that is painting the world around him in a darker light, and which might also explain his writer's block and bad temperament. At the same time, however, the fact that the dark presence makes itself known in front of other people who don't have Alan's knack for creativity does tend to lean the scales back in the "this is all real" camp. Alan Wake purposefully leaves this question vague because it's not important to the story, but for simplicity's sake, we'll operate under the assumption that everything is real for the purposes of this video. But I want to talk about characterization for a second, and specifically the character of Alan Wake and why he's such an interesting character. I mentioned earlier how Alan is out of his element as a resident of New York City stuck in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, so he has to deal with a new environment and people conditioned by that environment. That kind of cultural shock would put any reasonable person on edge, and considering Alan's brash personality, those feelings are exacerbated for him. Alan, to put it lightly, is a bit of a jerk, often getting angry with people for sometimes understandable and sometimes petty reasons. And honestly, I really like that. There's no rule stating that you have to like a main character, and following a character who is somewhat of an asshole is sometimes refreshing. Alan isn't so unlikable that he ruins the story, since his bigger outbursts are reserved for the villainous characters who deserve it, but it definitely adds a wrinkle to his characterization that many stories are either afraid to tackle or lean too heavily on. Unfortunately, the rest of the characters aren't nearly as interesting, with most of them either falling into archetypes or not having enough screen time to really develop a personality. Some characters like Barry and Sheriff Breaker are fun since the game spends time on them, but others like Hartman and especially Nightingale are underdeveloped and feel like devices to help move the story along. Speaking of which, let's dive a little deeper into the backstory, as it's important to know in order to understand the rest of what's happening. After Alan and Barry fend off the Taken at the farm with the Andersons' concert equipment, they find an Old Gods of Asgard record which features lyrics detailing the story of Thomas Zane and Barbara Jagger. Tom was a famous poet who used his love Barbara as his muse. One day, as Tom and Barbara were staying at the cabin on Cauldron Lake, Barbara accidentally drowned and sank to the bottom of the lake. This led to the Dark Presence, which resided in Cauldron Lake, taking her over, creating the woman in the mourning dress that Alan encounters. The Dark Presence, now in Barbara's form, offers to bring her back to Tom, which would require him to use the lake's supernatural abilities that makes fictional writing come true. Tom accepts this proposal and uses his poetry to bring Barbara back, but he soon realizes that she's been corrupted by the Dark Presence and that his writing is feeding the darkness and making it stronger. To undo his mistakes, Tom makes it so that the Dark Presence retreats into the lake and the cabin is destroyed, stealing the darkness once again. He erases himself mostly out of existence in the process and winds up in the Dark Place, where he becomes a part of the Bright Presence, which naturally opposes the dark. With this form, Tom is able to assist Alan during his journey, as he occasionally appears to Alan as a mysterious diver surrounded by light and is eventually revealed to be the one leaving the pages behind. Alan pieces this together by listening to the song, and determines that the Lady of the Light mentioned in the lyrics refers to Cynthia Weaver, a lady obsessed with light whom Alan met when he first arrived. The writer celebrates with Barry by drinking some of the Andersons' moonshine, which causes Alan to suddenly remember what happened the night Alice fell into the lake. Alan was so consumed with grief over the supposed death of his wife that Barbara Jagger took advantage of the situation and convinced him that he could write Alice back to life, just as she had done with Tom years ago. The Dark Presence forced Alan to write a story titled Departure, which would supposedly bring Alice back, though by doing so, Alan inadvertently made the darkness stronger. After a week of writing, Alan realizes what's going on and decides to write Thomas Zane into his story as a means to bring him back and use his light to escape from the Dark Presence, leading to Alan driving away and eventually crashing his car, where he would wake up with no memory. In the present, Alan wakes up with a new feeling of regret that what happened was his fault, and that's not the only bad news.
I wrote it. It's my fault.
That's right, James Joyce. It's your fault and you're gonna pay for it.
Agent Nightingale arrests Alan and Barry and locks them up at the Bright Falls Sheriff Station, where he explains that he's aware of Wake's abilities and believes him responsible for not only his wife's disappearance, but also for all the other oddities occurring around town. However, he realizes that the manuscript detailed these events happening, but before Nightingale can figure out what happens next, the Dark Presence sucks him outside, leaving Alan, Barry, and Breaker to escape. Alan informs them that they need to see Cynthia Weaver, and Breaker says that she lives in an abandoned power plant, so the three head through the darkness-infested town to reach a police helicopter and fly over there. While most of the locations Alan travels through have been natural or industrial, this is the first time since the beginning of the game where Alan travels through a residential area. It's cool seeing how much the town has changed now that the Dark Presence is starting to take over and corrupt everything. But this area also exemplifies how the level design is laid out, as the streets are confined spaces that make the progression more obvious to the player. Alan Wake features areas that are somewhat expansive but typically follow a linear path with occasional branching roads. The game has no maps to tell you where to go, all you have is your compass that indicates where your next objective is and what that objective is. Some of the landmarks you need to reach are visible in the distance, especially when you're in a clearing, which makes for an effective means of subtly guiding the player. As for the layout, Alan Wake's levels follow the typical wave-like pattern of quiet exploration moments and action scenes that keep the momentum going at a steady yet varied pace. You never really know until you enter a new location whether or not you'll be dealing with a barrage of Taken or a puzzle that needs to be solved in order to move on, and sometimes the game throws both at you at once. The levels aren't very large physically, except for sections where Alan is driving a vehicle, which accommodate for a car's faster speed by giving you much more space to work with, usually with wide roads or open areas. The linear stages with set pieces surrounded by quiet segments design is a classic formula for level building in video games, but Alan Wake uses its fog and shadow to hide the seams and make the world seem grander. Alan, Barry, and Sheriff Breaker make it to the power plant where Cynthia Weaver lives, but a flock of birds knocks Alan out of the helicopter, forcing him to make it there on foot. Weaver opens the door to Alan, letting him into a room filled with light and showing him the way to the well-lit room, where a shoebox containing Thomas Zane's last possessions resides. However, before they get there, Alan leaves to rescue Barry and Breaker after the helicopter crashes, and the trio climbs up a dam in order to make it back to Weaver and the well-lit room. Inside, Alan opens the shoebox and finds the clicker from his childhood, as well as a page that details Alan using the clicker to destroy the Dark Presence, confirming that Tom wrote that Alan would come to Cauldron Lake and destroy the darkness as a contingency plan before his sacrifice. Alan realizes he has the strength to finally end this nightmare once and for all, and resolves to vanquish the Dark Presence, rescue his wife, and save Bright Falls from the evil that lies beneath the lake. The next day, Alan leaves his companions behind in order to stop the Dark Presence on his own, traveling back to the cabin where it all started. After battling through the darkness, Alan confronts the Dark Presence and weakens it with his flare gun, sending the darkness retreating into the lake. Following Zane's page, Alan dives in after the Dark Presence and enters the Dark Place, where Tom introduces him to Mr. Scratch, an evil doppelganger of Alan that Tom sends back to the surface world in his place. In the final stretch, Alan hears the words of Tom and the resurrected Barbara from years ago, where Tom sees the darkness in her and cuts out her heart, and Alan then finds Barbara with a hole in her chest. By using the clicker on her, the Dark Presence is defeated, and back in the real world, the residents of Bright Falls are celebrating, and Alice, who is alive, swims onto the shore where the cabin was, calling out for Alan. In the Dark Place, Alan heads up to his room in the cabin in order to finish the manuscript, and the game ends with its cryptic yet iconic final lines.
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
Alan, wake up.
Naturally, this ending led to a lot of confusion from players when this game came out, especially since it basically leaves the main character in a state of limbo with no indication of whether or not he can leave. Remedy purposefully designed this ending not to deliver a solid conclusion because they were already planning additional story content for the game, so they treated the ending to this episode as they did the ones before it, set up plot material for the next ones. They even tried to assuage players who felt lost by assuring them in the credits that the story would continue, and continue it did, but before we move on, I do want to talk about my thoughts on the story. The studio wanted to create a cinematic game centered around solid mystery and unsettling supernatural horror, and they did a damn fine job. Alan Wake loves setting up questions and answering them in ways that clarify some details, but also bring up an entirely new set of enigmas that won't get resolved until later. The game constantly strings you along with the plot, teasing you with the explanations you desire, while pelting you with twists and turns that open up more conundrums, which is an excellent way to keep the players engaged. Through most of the story, you'll be given enough clarity on things to understand the situation, but will probably need to think in order to connect every grander detail and what their significance is to the plot. The story has phenomenal pacing too, as events proceed just fast enough to keep the narrative moving while letting you absorb the atmosphere and mood of each location, and on the whole, no area is too focused on either story or gameplay. The game balances both fairly well. If I did have any criticisms, it'd be how certain mysteries are handled that negatively impact the story because of the ambiguity. I'm not saying that I need every single question to be explained, or that developers can't leave some things open to interpretation, but some plot elements weaken the experience because Remedy didn't answer them. The page that Thomas Zane wrote about Alan beating the Dark Presence raises questions about who Alan is and what made him come to the lake in the first place, questions that the game never expands upon. We know that Tom wrote this page in 1970, which is years before Alan was born, meaning that Tom was likely responsible for bringing Alan into existence in the first place. But if that's the case, then why does Alan not mention it? The power Tom and Alan share is responsible for making events happen and influencing the actions of other people, and Alan is aware of this, so he has to understand the implication of Tom causing Alan's life to occur. That would be a tremendous weight to put on someone's mind, but Alan never seems to think about what this means for him. I guess his knowledge of the power makes him more willing to accept this potential reality, but I would have liked a little bit of acknowledgement on where Alan's mind is regarding this point. Also, there's the character of Mr. Scratch, Alan's doppelganger, who, I'll be frank, I don't like as a character. Normally I like evil versions of characters, but Mr. Scratch seems to me to have no real reason to exist in this universe. Tom says that there must be a balance between light and dark, which is why Mr. Scratch takes Alan's place in the real world, but this balance isn't addressed beforehand, so it feels more like the writers are trying to be symbolic with the whole light versus dark thing. He is brought up in the DLC episodes and appears in American Nightmare, where it's explained why he came into existence, but I think that the way his inclusion is handled in the main game is overall pretty sloppy. On the whole though, Alan Wake features a satisfying and entertaining, if somewhat heavy-handed, narrative that will no doubt appeal to horror and mystery fans or people who enjoy a good cinematic video game. But that's not the end of Alan Wake, as the story of Alan's struggle against the Dark Presence and the corruption within his own soul continues. The first DLC episode, The Signal, picks up with Alan still trapped in the Dark Place and working on the manuscript to Departure, though when the episode begins, Alan is wandering around a dark version of Bright Falls. Tom tells him not to go any further, but Alan continues onward anyway, finding himself slipping further and further into the Dark Place. Alan finds another manuscript page, but this time the words are jumbled and nonsensical, indicating that something went wrong with Alan's writing. To that end, the player comes across television screens that depict a scared Alan describing horrors that will tear the writer apart and turn him insane. Alan realizes that Tom is broadcasting a signal from a sawmill in the distance and sets off to reach him alongside the manifestation of Barry, which Alan's mind has conjured to help him along as well as taunt him. When he reaches the sawmill, Alan begins hallucinating about Alice and finds himself back in his home in New York, only Tom is also with him. Tom explains that Alan is slipping into his own mind and slowly going insane while working on the manuscript, causing the Dark Place to distort itself to Alan's growing madness. Alan refuses to believe this, however, and angrily sends Tom away, which causes the nearby television screens, complete with images of the insane Alan, to come to life and attack. After defeating them, Alan collapses and wakes up in the cabin, mumbling about finding a way out, leading into the second DLC episode, The Writer. This time, Alan wakes up at Hartman's clinic, briefly encountering the imaginary Barry before leaving him behind to meet with Tom. Tom once again directs Alan to head to the lighthouse, with Alan navigating through weird, disjointed locations and dealing with the Taken. Alan eventually makes it to the lighthouse after learning from Tom that while the real Alan is still stuck in the Dark Place writing Departure and is going crazy, the Alan we're controlling is a part of him that is fully conscious and determined not to give up. From the lighthouse, Alan's path to the cabin is clear, but to reach it, he must eliminate the vision of Barry, who turns hostile after realizing that he'll disappear if Alan makes it to the cabin and wakes up. Alan defeats Dark Barry and enters the cabin, finding his insane self writhing on the floor near the typewriter, with the determined Alan rejoining with the real one in order to regain his sanity. Alan wakes up inside the cabin and sits back down at his writing desk, about to start a new story where he'll write his own presence back into the real world, a story appropriately titled Return, ending Alan Wake. Once again, the signal and the writer don't provide a comprehensive conclusion where Alan saves the day, instead dealing with the consequences of his actions during the main game on himself. The game doesn't focus on the people in the real world, so we have no idea how Alice and Barry are dealing with Alan's disappearance, instead shifting to Alan's mental breakdown following his entrapment in the dark place. It's clear that the memories of him putting Alice and Bright Falls in danger are haunting him, as he's most likely being manipulated by the lingering power of the dark presence, stripping away the remains of his sanity. But at the end of it, Alan is almost right back where he was when the main game ended, only now it's clear what Alan's immediate goal is in terms of getting back home to the real world. The stories are fairly entertaining in the moment, but ultimately they don't provide enough substance to make the DLC episodes worth the journey. The DLCs only bring in one new gameplay element, the words that are scattered around each major area, although calling it new is technically incorrect since it first appeared at the end of the 6th episode. When Alan shines a light on a word, it turns into what they represent. For example, the word escape opens a pathway that lets Alan move on. I'm not a fan of this because it adds unnecessary wait time to tasks like retrieving ammo or grabbing items, though I do like this part where you can activate explosions that eliminate Taken as well as words that spawn them in. Something else I don't particularly like is how these DLCs reuse several world assets from the main game, with whole chunks of levels being placed in here in order to avoid designing something new. I understand this has a narrative reason behind it, and yes, it did allow them to get the DLC episodes out quicker, but it still comes off as cheap to me. Then there's the instances where the level design is nothing but objects and broken bits of scenery floating in the air, which I kinda like aesthetically, but usually involve heavy platforming, which, as I said, is not the game's forte. But when the episodes do get creative with their setting, it leads to some fascinating and memorable moments, such as the rotating rooms, which still to this day hold a special place in my mind when thinking about this game. I don't know if these episodes were rushed in development, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were, as while they add some interesting plot threads and help clear up the ending, they rehash too much to make them intriguing. That said, they are still worth playing since they do conclude the Alan Wake story, or specifically Season 1 of Alan Wake, which was meant to be followed up with 2 new projects, a spin-off game and Alan Wake 2. While the latter eventually became a mystery, the spin-off was released 2 years later on Xbox Live Arcade, and it brought back the character of Alan Wake and put him in a whole new scenario. Alan Wake's American Nightmare is structured as an episode of Night Springs, an in-universe TV show that is not so subtly based on horror anthology shows like The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits. It begins with Alan confronting Mr. Scratch in the town of Night Springs, Arizona, a normally peaceful town that has been taken over by darkness. Alan travels to several locations around Night Springs and meets some of its inhabitants, auto mechanic Emma Sloan, astronomist Dr. Rachel Meadows, and art curator Serena Valdivia. Through his interactions with them, Alan realizes that Mr. Scratch has already visited each location and caused trouble for the residents, and it's up to Alan to undo everything his doppelganger has done. He acquires part of a signal from a damaged satellite that lets him alter reality at the drive-in, but since the message is incomplete, the world doesn't change, allowing Mr. Scratch to come in and send Alan back in time a few hours, effectively erasing his progress. Alan realizes that Mr. Scratch intends to keep him stuck in a time loop forever, and resolves to keep changing reality to find a way to get rid of Mr. Scratch forever and save the town of Night Springs from the darkness. American Nightmare is less of a horror game, as the game is much more focused on raising the tension and action rather than the suspense. Alan can unlock a multitude of new weapons, including an SMG, a nail gun, an assault rifle, and a combat shotgun, but you need the required amount of pages before you can acquire them. You still only have 5 slots for weapons, but Alan is now more versatile in how he can take down threats. The game also introduces new variations of Taken as well, including a Taken that can materialize into birds, a Taken that splits into smaller, weaker copies of itself when exposed to light, and spiders that go down very quickly but are fast and harder to shoot. Alan can't hold as many flares, flashbangs, or flashlight batteries as before, and a Taken's shields can no longer be taken down by just pointing the flashlight at them. You need to burst your light to damage them, which also drains faster in American Nightmare. Despite this, I rarely ever found the need to replace batteries in this game, as while the meter depletes at a rapid pace, it replenishes just as quickly. American Nightmare features a semi-open world where Alan isn't railroaded down one specific path and can instead move freely about. The maps aren't very large, making navigation comfortable, but the game sometimes forces you to walk back and forth between locations to complete objectives, which was a problem in the original, but never to this degree. American Nightmare's production values feel simultaneously better and worse than Alan Wake for different reasons. The environments look really good, and I noticed there's less fog obscuring distant objects in this game, making the world feel much bigger. But the in-game cutscenes look absolutely stilted, marking a significant step down from the pre-rendered cutscenes of the previous game thanks to the lack of unique motion capture animations. I do love the live-action cutscenes that bridge each cycle together though, since they help add to the TV show aesthetic the Alan Wake series is going for. American Nightmare also takes a hit in the writing, as the dialogue is nowhere near as tight as the main game, and while the pages you collect still give you hints for upcoming sections, they aren't as engaging to read. I don't consider this a huge issue, but it does detract from the overall experience, especially when you juxtapose it with the stiffer presentation. And I wish we got more information on how the other characters from the previous game reacted to Alan's disappearance. While we know that Alice and Barry have partially moved on after Alan went missing, leaving them out of the main story and designating them to side dialogue and radio broadcasts is, in my mind, a missed opportunity. But let's talk about the major problem with American Nightmare that makes me cautious to call it a worthy successor: the repetitiveness. Because Alan and the other characters are caught in a time loop, they're forced to relive the game's events as reality keeps repeating itself and you need to perform the same tasks again. You need to complete 3 full cycles to beat the game, visiting the same 3 locations and talking to the same 3 people. Thankfully, it's not completely the same, as characters can remember what happened on previous cycles and offer more and more assistance. For example, at the motel, you have to gather 3 items and place them at the oil rig to destroy it, but in the second cycle, Emma's already collected 2 items for you, and in the third cycle, they're already at the oil rig. Still, your enjoyment of American Nightmare hinges on whether or not you're okay with going through the same maps 3 different times. Personally, it wasn't a deal breaker for me, as the levels aren't very long, and since the game can be beaten in under 4 hours, it's not like American Nightmare overstays its welcome, repeated levels notwithstanding. I think players who enjoyed the main game will be able to find some enjoyment out of American Nightmare's story, and even if you don't, you'll probably have fun with the wave-based survival arcade mode. There's some stuff to admire in American Nightmare, but its status as a spin-off with a shorter development cycle did impact it negatively. During his adventures, Alan learns that Mr. Scratch is trying to prevent the sun from rising again and that he came into existence thanks to dark rumors about Alan Wake spreading after his disappearance, which the powers of Cauldron Lake used to create the doppelganger. By finally rewriting reality at the drive-in, Mr. Scratch is consumed by the light of the film projector and is defeated, and Alan appears to leave Night Springs and rejoin Alice in the real world. However, the narrator questions whether these events are happening in Alan's head, with the final scene depicting Barry, who has fallen asleep watching the show, waking up when he believes he hears Alan's voice. In yet another ambiguous ending, depending on your interpretation, Alan has either escaped from Night Springs back into the real world, or is still trapped inside the dark place and is only imagining his escape. And once again, Remedy states in the American Nightmare credits that the story of Alan Wake isn't over, which seemed to be another sign that Alan Wake 2 was on the way. But that ended up becoming another puzzle for fans to decipher. During the Xbox One reveal event in 2013, Remedy revealed the next game they were working on, Quantum Break, a third-person action-adventure game that revolved around time travel. Alan Wake fans expressed disappointment as they were hoping for a sequel, but the next day, Sam Lake released a video acknowledging fan concerns and stating that while Remedy did want to make Alan Wake 2 at some point, the original didn't make enough money to develop it at that time. In 2015, Polygon released a 13-minute gameplay demonstration of an internal prototype demo of Alan Wake 2 created by Remedy shortly after the first game was released. The demo level doesn't establish the planned story of the game, nor was it meant to be in the final build. Rather, its purpose was to explore the moods and atmospheres Alan Wake 2 would highlight. The demo shows off some gameplay elements like enhanced environment interactions and new behaviors for the Taken, but is very similar to Alan Wake, and many aspects were later recycled for American Nightmare. As for why exactly Remedy didn't have the support to make Alan Wake 2, that's where Microsoft's role comes into play. While Remedy owned the rights to the Alan Wake IP, Microsoft owned the publishing rights, and so without commitment from the company on a sequel, Remedy needed to find a new publisher. The developer showed the prototype off to multiple publishers and eventually went back to Microsoft, who weren't willing to greenlight another Alan Wake game, but were very interested in Remedy's ideas for Quantum Break, leading to another team-up for that project. Unfortunately, Microsoft's hold over publishing prevented Remedy from gaining complete control over the direction Alan Wake 2 would go, and considering the studio was also busy with Quantum Break and their follow-up Control, the next Alan Wake game was put on the back burner. But it might not be on that back burner for long. Remedy became a public company in 2017 and bought the publishing rights to Alan Wake from Microsoft 2 years later. This did not decisively mean that Remedy was moving forward with Alan Wake 2, but it does allow Remedy to bring Alan Wake to other consoles. So far this hasn't happened yet, but a multi-platform release might be a good sign that a sequel is in the cards. Not to mention, Control featured references to Alan Wake, and the main character appears in the Awe DLC, adding new details to the mythos. Remedy's next title is confirmed to take place in a Remedy shared universe, which includes Alan Wake and Control, with the studio hinting that future releases would also belong to this universe. That's given fans renewed hope that the world of Alan Wake will continue to grow, and it's very likely that at some point in the future, the company will finally announce Alan Wake 2. And that would be a huge deal, because as I discovered while playing Alan Wake again, it really is an engaging, thrilling, and entertaining game that deserves more attention. I still don't know if I can agree that Alan Wake is a masterpiece, but it is a really good game and remains a personal favorite of mine, and examining this game has only made me love it more. The gameplay might not be that innovative, the facial animations might sometimes be awkward, most of the characters might not be fully formed, and the story might be needlessly cryptic at times, but for the most part, none of these problems detract from the experience. Alan Wake has a wonderfully dark atmosphere, a narrative that keeps you on your toes, and tightly designed game mechanics that contribute to a title that still feels great to both play and watch unfold. I completely understand now why there's so much fan demand for a sequel, and hell, I now count myself among those eagerly anticipating what Remedy has in store next for the Alan Wake universe. Whether that ends up being Alan Wake 2 or something entirely new, if the quality of Remedy's other titles is anything to go by, it'll be as enriching and as well crafted as the original game, and hopefully just as mysterious.